You must have seen this, whether in movies, TV series, or elsewhere. Planes dropping this as a countermeasure to avoid being shot down by a missile. And in fact, this is one of the most effective current countermeasures against missiles in use around the world. In fact, these flares, as they are called, have relatively good effectiveness in general combat environments, diverting the missile's focus from the plane or helicopter directly to them. And these flares are only meant to divert heat-seeking missiles, since these missiles always target the hottest part of an aircraft, which is always the engines. Therefore, flares, which are essentially tubes containing magnesium or zinc and some other compounds, and that burn with very intense heat, usually above 2,000 degrees Celsius hotter than an aircraft engine, and that because of this are able to blind the missile's seeker head, which is very, very sensitive to heat, and redirect it straight to these flares, thus giving the aircraft a very good chance until a radar-guided missile is launched. That's when it gets complicated. Since radar-guided missiles are a type of missile that uses radar as a guidance system to accurately hit their target. In other words, flares are useless against this type of missile. The operating principle of a radar-guided missile is relatively simple. These missiles contain a radar, which constantly emits electromagnetic waves and detects the return of these waves when they hit an object, in this case an enemy plane. When these waves hit the target, part of them is reflected back toward the missile. The missile's radar then receives this return signal and processes it to determine the target's location, distance, and speed. Based on this information, the missile can adjust its trajectory to approach the target. The missile then calculates and makes the necessary adjustments to intercept it, using algorithms and control systems to determine the best trajectory and the speed needed to accurately reach the target. When the missile is close enough to the target, it activates its detonation mechanism, which can be an explosive warhead, a kinetic warhead, or another type of destructive device, with the goal of hitting the target and causing significant damage. What does the missile actually see when it sends and receives these waves? It's important to explain a key concept that was omitted here, the so-called radar signature, which refers to the characteristics of an object that affect the way it reflects and scatters radar waves. In other words, it is a measure of detecting and identifying an object by radar based on the characteristics of the return signal. In simple words, it refers to what the radar sees or receives as a return after emitting such waves against, for example, an enemy aircraft. And as was very well proven back in 1960 by Pyotr Ufimtsev, it is possible to make a large aircraft, like a Boeing 747, appear on radar screens as small as a little bird, an area of study known as stealth. But even using this camouflage, a stealth aircraft can still be shot down by a sophisticated radar-guided missile. So, how does an F-35B literally dodge radar-guided missiles? At first, just like all aircraft, it would use Chaff, which is an electronic countermeasure used in military aircraft to confuse missile radars. Chaff consists of small strips of aluminum, metallized fiberglass, or metallized plastic. These strips are released into the air by chaff dispensers, usually located at the rear of the aircraft. When released, chaff creates small clouds that generate a large number of radar echoes, which resemble multiple targets, as if several aircraft suddenly appeared in that location. This causes confusion in the missile's radar, making it difficult to distinguish the real aircraft from the echoes generated by chaff. The goal is to divert the missile radar's attention from the real aircraft, so the missile will head toward that cloud instead of the real aircraft. Since the chaff is made of conductive materials, which are highly reflective to radar waves, this allows the aircraft to escape. But as with everything in life, technology advances, and modern missiles can quickly distinguish a cloud of chaff from the real aircraft based on certain algorithms, calculations, and frequency changes in the chaff, since as it disperses in the air, its radar signature also changes. In addition, the computers in modern missiles also calculate the speed at which the chaff is moving. Releasing chaff into the air doesn't make it move faster. In fact, it is constantly slowing down. And a real plane is maintaining or increasing its speed to escape the missile. Using this data, the missile's computers ignore false targets and stay focused on the real plane. And this is where the mysterious device of the F-35B fighters comes into play, which is dropped from the tail and stays at a safe distance from the aircraft as soon as it becomes necessary. This device has 3 levels of jamming countermeasures against missiles. First, it acts when an enemy fighter tries to lock onto the aircraft as a target. Then, the fighter's computers emit jamming signals calculated by them and transmitted to this device through a fiber optic cable. This device then emits them, trying to disrupt this locking process. If the radar of the enemy aircraft or missile manages to lock onto the fighter, then the fighter's computers and this device start trying to break that lock, actively interfering with the algorithms that track the fighter, diverting the missile to another target. And finally, if the 2 previous steps fail and the missile keeps coming straight at the fighter, this device then starts to simulate the radar signature of the fighter, directing the missile toward it instead of the fighter. And believe it or not, this works, and it's all done in milliseconds. And this is what I consider to be technology inherited from aliens, because it's simply amazing. Although there is so little information available about the details of this device, which is essentially an emitter because it is sensitive military technology, but even so, its operation is quite amazing. And this is just one of several active jamming and evasion countermeasures against missiles and radars that the F-35 family has at its disposal. But there are many others, both active and passive. For example, the F-35B looks like a relatively normal plane, but if you pay closer attention, you'll notice that all its access panels have serrated doors instead of straight ones like they normally would. The landing gear doors have serrated edges. The door that hides the ladder is serrated. Both doors that hide the lift fan also have serrated parts. And several areas of the plane are like this, especially the engines. And we can see this same principle implemented in the B-2 Spirit, the most expensive plane in the world, in regions like the engine air intakes. And there's a reason for that. To reduce the radar signature, the strength of the return signal emitted by a radar after hitting a surface will be greater if that surface is, among other things, long and flat. So, to reduce the strength of the return signal and consequently make the radar signature, and in general, the aircraft as undetectable as possible, this serrated design is adopted. Thus, instead of the wave hitting a flat surface and reflecting perfectly back to the radar, it will split into smaller waves that scatter in different directions. Then why not make the whole aircraft serrated? Physics simply doesn't allow it. Second, it's already coated with a material that absorbs most of the energy from electromagnetic waves. And third, if we look closely from other angles, we can see that this fighter jet has almost no parts at 90 degrees. Its entire exterior has panels set at various angles, precisely to reflect radar waves in another direction. Even the vertical stabilizers are angled and not perfectly straight. Do you know what else has a serrated pattern? This 600 ml collapsible silicone sports bottle. Of course, its serrated pattern isn't meant to deflect radar waves, but rather it's part of its feature that allows it to fold or collapse and take up much less space in your bag. And when folded, it also has a much smaller radar signature, making it harder to detect in your bag or in your hands when you're carrying it completely empty. The store is also full of various products to make your life and your daily routine easier. Stop by and get your product. back to the video. Well, it's already coming to an end. But until now, we've seen part of the passive systems against missiles. But this family of fighter jets has several passive systems, but also active systems that actively counter direct missile attacks. There are so many that I think it's better to make a separate video about them.